Hello good people and welcome back into another Parry This Arthurian Legend video. Today's topic is King Esclabor, the father of Palamedes, Safir, and Segwarides. This character is a lesser known man from Arthurian literature who arrives in Britain with his sons after fleeing defeat and devastation, only to become a great lord in a new land, and delivers some of the best knights of the land to King Arthur's court. This tale is one of a man rising like a phoenix from very little to great status through skill, talent, wisdom, and no small amount of luck. So let's dive on in and learn what there is to know about King Esclabor. King Esclabor was long ago the king of Babylon. Several years after his oldest son Palamedes was born, Esclabor was forced out of Babylon by a ruthless tyrant who conquered Babylon. Esclabor would flee to Rome seeking asylum, but would find the city in a state of disarray. The city had been invaded by barbarians and was being sacked. Esclabor would seek out the emperor in an attempt to understand what was happening and possibly to help the emperor, who had long been his friend. Esclabor would find the emperor being taken captive by a group of barbarians, and not fearing for his own life would charge them, killing several and scattering the rest. Once released, the emperor would be grateful to his old friend for the rescue, but was unable to offer asylum as he had already lost the city. The emperor planned to leave Rome and make his way to Constantinople, where his cousin ruled, and to seek asylum there. However, out of gratitude, the emperor would lead Esclabor to his treasury, where he gifted him with 3 chests full of gold, and commanded a company of his guard to accompany Esclabor and his sons to the nearby port, where they were given a ship and a small escort. From here, the emperor left for the Eastern Empire and advised Esclabor to flee to the west and make for the Isle of Britain. King Esclabor would set out for this strange island with his 3 sons, Palamedes, Safir, and Segwarides, as well as his daughter Florine. Thus, arriving in northern Britain with his family and 3 chests of imperial gold, King Esclabor would begin a new life in Britain. In this new and strange land, Esclabor and his family were no more royal than the next house, but had a few distinct advantages. The first being the immense wealth that had been given by the emperor. Upon arriving in Britain, they were able to immediately establish themselves as a high-born and wealthy family. Esclabor would use some of the money to purchase an estate from an impoverished noble in the kingdom of Anglesey, which in the modern day would be part of the northwest coast of Wales. Here, Esclabor would purchase 3 large trading vessels and would establish a trade route between Ireland and Wales, which would provide his family with a substantial and steady income. The family, not altogether comfortable in this alien environment, would make substantial upgrades to the modest estate, including significant renovations and defensive fortifications. These fortifications included a wide moat, a wooden curtain wall, and 4 square towers, and a gatehouse that included a drawbridge. Esclabor was also able to convince a number of families to settle in the land he owned around his small castle, and farm for him under his protection. Within a few short years, nearly 24 families lived on his lands, which proved to be fertile, and under his protection would also prove to be safe and quiet. Esclabor, no longer a king, made himself a lord in all but name, in just 5 short years, and his sons were the beginning of his knights. Esclabor had taught his sons what he could of arms and combat, but was a foreigner in these lands, and therefore unable to instruct them in the ways of this land. In a desire to assimilate and give his children the best chance they had to succeed in Britain, Esclabor would set out on his own to hire a master-at-arms to instruct his sons in the lance and the sword. It would not take long before he would hear of King Pellinor, the lord of the Isles of Listinois, a small group of islands off the coast of Anglesey. It was said that Pellinor and his family were amongst the greatest warriors in that part of Britain, and that among them could be found some of the best combat instructors. Esclabor would board one of his trading ships with his son Palamedes and would sail for Listinois. It would be a short journey, but they would arrive safely and would be welcomed by Pellinor himself, who would be waiting by the docks with his young son Lamorak. They would welcome Esclabor with open arms and would invite him to a feast in his honor. After the feast, Esclabor would discuss his need for a skilled master-at-arms to instruct his sons. Pellinor would pronounce that he would be more than happy to send one of his best men to teach them everything it meant to be a knight, and to one day anoint them as knights themselves, if they could prove themselves worthy. There was, however, a catch to this generous offer. King Pellinor was a skilled warrior and a well-respected king, from an ancient line of kings, but his lands were small and his attending lords were few in number and waning impressive. King Pellinor needed Esclabor more than he knew. In exchange for providing Esclabor with a knight to train his sons, as well as several men-at-arms for his household, Pellinor required an oath of fealty from Esclabor. Esclabor's lands were the nearest to his kingdom and offered a natural extension and a connection with the mainland that Pellinor desperately needed. And as Pellinor pointed out, Esclabor had made himself a lord in many ways, but legally he held the land by the grace of someone who did not technically have the authority to grant it. Pellinor offered to make him a lord by right and bring him under his protection if he would swear fealty. In exchange, he would marry one of his family to Esclabor's daughter, Florine, as well as taking on his eldest son, Palamedes, as his personal squire. Seeing the wisdom and great benefit in this deal, Esclabor would consent and would swear fealty to Pellinor. Pellinor would make him a lord, with deed and title to the estate he had built up, as well as the neighboring lands occupied by the farmers Esclabor had attracted. Lord Esclabor would leave his son Palamedes with Pellinor, and would take with him Sir Brian the Strong-Shield and a dozen good men-at-arms back to his estate, which he would now rule by the grace of King Pellinor. Here we leave the tale of Esclabor for a while and move on to that of his son, the young Palamedes. Palamedes was a strong young boy with olive skin and dark black hair. He was dedicated to his family and so gladly agreed to stay with King Pellinor even though he knew he would miss his family greatly. He dedicated himself to his studies in King Pellinor's court and learned quickly. He was of course instructed in arms by the best men King Pellinor had to offer. Here he learned to master the longsword and shield, as well as riding, jousting, and other chivalric matters of combat. Palamedes would also be instructed on courtly chivalry and the languages of Britain. He would take to these less easily than his martial arts, but would over time gain mastery over them as well. All the time he would be training and learning with Lamorak, the king's own son, who was around the same age as Palamedes. For 5 years Palamedes would live, eat, fight, and breathe as he was instructed at Pellinor's court, until at the age of 20, war would come to those lands. As it would happen, the petty king of Anglesey would not like the fact that Esclabor had essentially stolen some of his land, and fortified it into a castle, which was now garrisoned with foreign troops. What was worse, Esclabor's land had become the richest of the kingdom, and since Esclabor did not owe fealty to him, he saw none of this wealth. So it was that one day the king of Anglesey would send a small group of soldiers to burn some of Esclabor's farm. Learning of this aggression, Esclabor would send his master-at-arms as well as 5 of his soldiers to confront the invaders. They would engage the intruders and slay all but one, which they would bring back for questioning. From this man, Esclabor would learn that the petty king intended to invade his fief and bring it back into his kingdom after killing or enslaving everyone who lived there. Esclabor would immediately prepare his defenses, raising his local militia and arming them as best he could. Even so, his forces only amounted to roughly 50 fighting men, most of which were poorly equipped and had little to no training. Knowing this was not enough, Esclabor would send Sir Brian to Listinois to call for aid from his king, Pellinor. In good conditions with the wind on their side, a ship could reach Listinois from Anglesey in a little over a day. So best case scenario, Lord Esclabor didn't expect reinforcements for at least 2 days. In the meantime, the petty king of Anglesey had learned of his attack party's defeat and planned a full-scale invasion. He called to his lords for their best men and assembled a force of over 200 men-at-arms, archers, and knights. This took nearly a day and a half, but by night on the second day they were on their way to Esclabor's estate. Lord Esclabor would organize his defenses as best he could. He provided shields and spears to his militia and had them drilling in the field outside his moat, learning to block and thrust, and how to maintain a basic shield wall. The women and children of his lance he set aboard his ships and commanded that they make for Listinois until the battle was over. Sending his son Safir to watch the border, he waited for the assault. The ships Sir Brian had taken to Listinois fared well on their way there, arriving in just under a day. Pellinor received him immediately, and as soon as the situation had been relayed, set about raising his knights and archers to support Esclabor. He knew that haste was more important than numbers, and trusting to the superiority of his soldiers, set out with just 50 mounted knights and 100 archers by dawn on the second day. Palamedes and Lamorak would accompany King Pellinor as his personal squires. At dawn on the third day, Safir spotted a column of soldiers coming through the valley and over the hills at the border of Esclabor's lands. He waited long enough to assess the numbers of the enemy before quickly riding back to his father's estate. Hearing of how badly outnumbered and outmatched they were, Esclabor decided to divide his small forces. Half of the peasant militia he set atop his walls and within his gates to defend his castle. The other half he sent with his men-at-arms and his sons Safir and Segwarides, and 11 of his 15 archers to a neighboring hill, which stood higher than the surrounding land. He kept only 4 archers in the castle, 1 for each of his towers, and these he supplied with 2 barrels of arrows each, instructing them to make every shot count. The men on the hill were to set the archers at the top and protect them with a ring of shields and spears, so they could divide the attack, and keep the petty king fighting on 2 fronts. The hill they were on was not very tall, but provided a commanding elevation to the otherwise flat land, and was very steep, which meant they would be safe from a cavalry charge, meaning anyone that wanted to reach them would have to do so under fire and on foot. With this plan in place, Esclabor and his men waited and watched the dust from the enemy column get closer and closer. By noon on the third day, the petty king's army had moved through Esclabor's land and had established a camp just out of bowshot of both the castle and the hill. Because of the natural lay of the land, the only way to attack would be to go between them, as they needed to circle around the moat to get to the narrowest part by the front gate, which was protected by a drawbridge. The petty king would decide to divide his forces, sending the larger portion to attack the hill, while sending the smaller part to assault the castle. The initial assault would be strong strong and would show the petty king's hand. However, Esclabor's plan was a good one. Despite the better armor and training of the petty king's army, the natural slope of the hill and the moat around the castle slowed them down enough that Esclabor's few archers were able to inflict significant casualties. After about 2 hours of fighting, the petty king's forces would withdraw, having suffered some 24 casualties and inflicting only 2 upon Esclabor's forces. This encouraged the defense, but was not the end of the day. The petty king had one more card to show. He ordered a redoubled assault, this time focused entirely on the hill, with only enough men on the rear to protect their backs from the arrows, all the while knowing that the remainder of his men, who were following a half day behind, would be there soon, and would be able to engage the castle directly if they could take that hill. His forces would commit entirely and would move slowly up the hill in a locked shield formation. Safir and Segwarides would organize the defense of the hill and would direct a shield wall to form facing the onslaught, and ordering their archers to take their shots carefully, aiming for openings in the formation. Despite their determination to hold the hill, defeat was all but imminent. When the offensive formation met the line, the militia and the men-at-arms were able to initially hold the line. However, one at a time, the militiamen would fall to a careful jab of a spear, or a quick darting slash of an enemy sword, and the line began to crumble. As a whole would appear, a soldier or two would push in, and close quarters infighting would commence. Safir and Segwarides would close in on the attackers, and being skilled and strong fighters who had been trained by an expert for 5 years now, would handle them quickly enough. But the line could not hold. Suddenly, the enemy commander would call out to brace, and then push, and a wedge of men would suddenly break through the shield wall, and chaos would ensue. Everyone was fighting man to man, and the poorly trained and equipped militia were not prepared for this type of sortie. As men fell all around them, Safir and Segwarides were back to back, ready to make their last stand, when a trumpet sounded very near the hill, and they were aware of the sound of thundering horse hooves. No one had noticed Pellinore's arrival, as they were so intent on the combat on the hill, but he landed his troops and was leading his knights directly into the petty king's right flank. The surprise cavalry charge was devastating, and they rolled through the enemy flank like a sharp scythe through wheat. Some of the men on the hill faltered, and the two brothers were able to seize that moment to organize their remaining men into a small defensive circle again. The enemy would recover, but would split, with only a small portion returning their attention to the hill's defenders, and the rest running down the hill to join the counterattack against Pellinore's knights. All this time, Pellinore's archers were making their way around the hill to put themselves between the castle and the hill. Seeing the routed infantry running down the steep hill towards the knights who were in amongst the army, cutting them to pieces, the archers took position, knocked, aimed, and fired as one. Their powerful longbows sang as a wave of arrows leapt forward, striking many of the men running down the hill, and causing a bloody tumble of dead and dying soldiers on the way down. Safir and Segwarides would see this and would order a charge. Their men would raise their shields, set their spears, and charge the remaining enemy force, driving them down with their spears and finishing them off in force. They would then move towards the archers and instruct them to make for the castle walls, where they would be able to rain down on the enemy army that Pellinore's knights were pushing closer and closer to the moat. Without opposition, they would make it across the drawbridge, which would raise behind them. Here they would set up on the wall and in the towers closest to the enemy army, and would begin to assail them with volley after volley of well-aimed shots. As this was happening, Pellinore would regroup with his knights, drawing back and preparing for a second charge. Before charging a second time, Pellinore would call for the petty king's surrender, but trusting to his late lord's surprise arrival, the petty king would spit and say that he would die before surrendering. Pellinore would signal to resume fire, and the archers would once again rain arrows down on the enemy army from the castle 5 times before stopping at the call of Pellinore's trumpets when his second charge would start. This time, not taken by surprise, the enemy army would meet them with spears set, and would slow the charge significantly. King Pellinore's own horse would be wounded, and he would be thrown to the ground. Pellinore would rise ready to meet the enemy, and would be rushed by the petty king and several of his knights. Before being overwhelmed by the attack, Sir Brian, as well as Lamorak and Palamedes, would arrive at his side, and together they would cut down the enemy knight. Palamedes would block a strike meant for Pellinore with his shield, and without thinking would lunge his own sword, and would catch the petty king under the chin, plunging his sword clean through the enemy king's throat. As the enemy army realized their king had died, most of the survivors, of which there were not many, would lay down their arms and surrender. As this scene unfolded, the reinforcements the petty king had expected would arrive, but seeing defeat and devastation before them, would dip their banners, bow to Pellinore before turning and leaving. Victory had been achieved, and Pellinore would absorb absorb all of Anglesey into his kingdom, and would receive oaths of fealty from the remaining lords who had not died in that battle. For their bravery on the field and their skill at arms in the battle, Lamorak, Palamedes, Safir, and Segwarides would all be anointed as knights by King Pellinor himself. There would be a great feast where Esclabor would be appointed as Pellinor's chief lord here on the continent, and was assigned with bringing greater order and prosperity to all of Anglesey, which they had not had under the petty king. Over the years, Lord Esclabor would become rich and powerful, but would always remain the shrewd and wise man that had built their family up from very little after a crushing defeat to the great noble house of Britain that they had become. As for Palamedes, Safir, and Segwarides, they would set out as knights errant to discover what fate had in store for them. Their tales will come later.